Hello, I'm the first presenter and I don't know how to share my PPT file here.
Hi.
Hi.
Have you your file open at the end?
I sent you to the IACR email.
If you have it open on your computer, you can share it. I'll show you.
How?
Okay, so do you have it open somewhere on your computer?
Open.
Yeah, as in like have it open but minimized. I'll give you an example. I'll show you what I mean. So this is my screen, for example. So see down here, I have mine there and I click on it. It's like that.
Oh, I see.
So if you have it down there, but when you share, you need to share just the screen. You need to share, sorry, just the window, not the full screen. Otherwise, we won't be able to see you. Does that make sense? I'll show you. So I'll share my screen there. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so can you see my screen?
No. I'm working on mine. Wait.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. Oh. Hold on. 근데 잠깐만. 뭐 어떻게 해야 되는지 모르겠어. 네, it doesn't work. Like 창.
그게 아니고.
I think it's going to be more good. Tools expensive on the same time. Maybe we can choose an answer. Should we start? Right, so the first part is to test the microphone. Is that working? It's mainly for the online
Can you
people.
hear me?
We can hear you. You hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Right, so good start. So yes, let's make a start. So hi everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Richard Remley, and I'm going to be presenting on this panel shortly, but I'm also chairing it. And myself and the other participant in the room here, we think that it's best to do presentation, then 5 to 8 minutes questions, then the next presentation, rather than doing all the presentations at once, because that breaks it up a bit, make sure that everyone gets some questions, and then if there's any time left over at the end, we can open it up to the floor. Does that sound good to both online participants? Yeah, okay. So as you know, we get 20 minutes to present. I'll time it and I'll give everyone a little nudge when it's 15 minutes, so you know you've got around 5 minutes to go. So yeah, I think that's all we need to do with housekeeping. So our first online participant is Lee. Are you ready to go, Lee?
Not yet. I think I don't have an authority to share my PPT and I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, we're going to share it now, so we can see it on our screen.
Oh, good.
Can online participants see that too? If at any point you can't hear or you can't see what you feel like you need to be able to see, just drop us a message in the chat.
Okay.
And if we're not responding, make us aware some other way, maybe just butt in. So yeah, so Lee's going first. Can we get Lee on our screen with the little image so that we can see her too?
인재 일로 와봐.
Right, yeah, so that's great. So we can see the centre and the sides. Right, Lee, so whenever you're ready, you have 20 minutes and then we'll give time for some questions at the end of that as well before moving on to the next presentation.
I'm sorry, but I don't know how to move the slides. I'm so sorry.
Yes, so can you just say next slide and then we click it in the room here and it should all move along. So whenever you're ready, just say next slide or click. Is that okay?
Okay, okay. So you
So
handle the PPT. Okay,
yeah.
Good evening here and good morning to those joining from the other time zones. My name is Songhwa Lee and I teach sociology of education at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. Because Koreans state the family name first, my surname is Lee, so please feel free to call me Songhwa. The goal of today's presentation is to introduce a comprehensive explanatory model of teacher agency, TA, that is grounded in what I call the critical realist relational approach, abbreviated CRRA. Click, please. This approach explicitly integrates two lines of critical realist thought. Margaret Archer's realist social theory and Pier Paolo Donati's critical realist relational sociology. To explain why this synthesis matters, let me situate myself. In 2012, I completed my PhD in education at the University of Cambridge using Anthony Giddens' structuration theory. And my Dr. Viva, an external examiner from the University of Warwick, unsurprisingly advised me to study Archer's work in depth. I took that advice seriously and for the past decade have explored Archer's theory. Over time, I discovered that Archer's framework, powerful as it is, remains implicitly individualistic. Donati, a longtime collaborator of Archer, supplies the missing relational dimensions with his concept of relational reflexivity and the sui generis reality of social relations. By building on Donati's recent advances, I have applied a relational lens to theoretical and empirical work with Korean teachers and developed the model that I will share with you today. Click, please. Click 3 slides. Click and click. Then why do we need a new model? Despite 2 decades of scholarships, prevailing approaches to teacher agency dominated by pragmatism remains empiricist, individualistic, and transactional. They catalog what teachers do within structures, yet rarely explain how agency itself emerges. By fixating on transaction between individuals and structures, these accounts leave the causal relational processes between the two a theoretical black box. The CRRA illuminates that box by positing 3 distinct reflexive mechanisms: personal, interpersonal, and relational, and by granting social relation an ontological status that equals structure, agency, and culture, commonly referred to as SOC. Click, please. To develop the model, the study followed the critical realist methodology. The stage 1 is retroduction, moving from the empirical to the real, asking what entities and powers must exist for TA to emerge. We critically examine ontological propositions from Archer and Donati, then drafted a tentative model of TA based on CRRA. During retroduction, we shift from the real to the empirical domain by testing our hypothesized mechanisms, relational, personal, and the empirically identified interpersonal reflexivity against longitudinal data from South Korean teachers. This step demonstrates that the 3 forms of reflexivity are both empirically observable and analytically distinct. Stage 3 is a synthesis, integrating theoretical insights within empirical evidence to refine the model. Click, please. Next. Let's examine Archer's realist social theory in 3 points. First, analytical dualism allows Archer to keep structure and culture analytically distinct from agency. Second, the morphogenetic cycle traces the temporal sequence from T1 structural conditioning through T2, T3 social interaction to T4 structural and agential elaboration or reproduction. Third, personal reflexivity is the mediatory mechanism linking structural conditioning and action. It is the internal conversation through which individuals weigh personal concerns against social conditions, explaining why two teachers in identical contexts can act in different ways. Next, please. Any blind spots in Archer? However, Archer treats social relations merely as ties instantiated by individuals. She does not grant them ontological status with its own causal powers. The social relation is either treated as structural backdrops or subsumed under individual action, like I collaborated with him. That is where Donati enters the conversation. Donati corrects this oversight with 3 prepositions. First, relations are real entities endowed with emergent causal powers, that is, generating relational goods or evils. Thus, in CRS, social relation and their relational reflexivity alongside personal reflexivity act as causal bridges between structure and action. Next, please. Second, social relations generate relational goods and evils, trust or mistrust, care or envy, that cannot be possessed by individuals, the way social capital can. Donati argued that relational goods are produced and enjoyed only through relations, not by individuals. Next, please. Third, according to Donati, distinct from personal reflexivity, that is personal emergent power of individuals, relational reflexivity is the emergent power of social relation itself, guided by second-person ethics, the I-U standpoint. Donati recently asserts that the limit of Archer is individualizing reflexivity, solely addressing the self from the first-person ethics. By contrast, for Donati, the reflexive subject is the individual in relation, not merely individuals. Thus, the prime question shifts from what shall I do within this situation to what shall you and I do for our relation in relational reflexivity. Next, please. The book, The Relational Subject by Donati and Archer, depicts on its cover a cloud-like form floating between interacting persons. That image visualizes, I think, the emergent we relation, an entity greater than the sum of its parts, and capable of acting back upon both individuals and structures by generating relational goods or evils. The social relation exists in between interacting individuals as an emergent sui generis reality. Next, please. So, to develop a tentative model of agency, I combined Archer's stratified ontology of structure, agency, culture, SOC, with Donati's theory that social relations are sui generis realities. Consequently, at T1, T2, you cannot see the picture properly, but relational structure now sits alongside material structure, culture, and agents. During T2, T3, 2 reflexive mechanisms, personal and relational, operate, and relational reflexivity alone can generate the emergent we relation. By T3 to T4, the cycle yields transformed or reproduced relation, structure, agency, and culture. Across the full T1 to T4 morphogenetic sequence, human agency relationally emerges. 2 slides, please. Next. Yeah. Now it's time to test these reflexive mechanisms if they are distinctly manifested in the empirical world using longitudinal data gathered at Nara School, a vocational high school in South Korea. The school, according to our regional survey of 305 teachers, scored highest in relational goods such as trust and collaboration among teachers. I conducted multiple phase interviews with Sunho, a pseudonym, an 8th-year teacher, and his team leader, Kiyu, in 2021 and 2025 this year. This longitudinal design was informed by Donati's theory that it takes certain time to generate weird relations. In the empirical study, 3 reflexivities were articulated. In practice, personal reflexivity argued by Archer is the inner I dialogue, teachers weighing their own personal concerns against context. Interpersonal reflexivity is the IU adjustment where a teacher recalibrates position or tone in a dyadic interactions. Notably, Donato treated this dyadic interpersonal level as part of one broad category called relational reflexivity, but our study splits it off and reserves relational reflexivity for a third deeper form, the we dialogue, a novel finding of this empirical study. While Donati articulates relational reflexivity as grounded in second-person ethics, IU, and dialogical reciprocity, this frame remains limited to dyadic interaction and tends to anchor reflexivity in the individual's moral response to the other. That was why Archer claimed that relational reflexivity is subsumed under personal reflexivity, because the reflexive subject is ultimately I, even within the framework of individual in relation. In contrast, through theoretical retroduction and this empirical corroboration, I could confirm that the first person plural ethics, we, as the ontological and ethical foundation of genuine relational reflexivity. This definition decenters the individual I and reconceptualizes the relational reflexivity as a relational property of emergent we subjects co-constituted through shared orientation toward relational goods. Crucially, only relational reflexivity can generate we subjects, whereas personal and interpersonal forms cannot. Empirically validating the CRRI model's claim that social relations possess their own causal powers. Next, please. This is personal reflexivity. I will skip reading the quotes of personal and interpersonal reflexivity due to the time limit. Please skim through it. Next page, interpersonal reflexivity. Then next page. Relational reflexivity became evident in the we relations, which Sunho articulated. By Sunho's 8th year at Nara School, he habitually said our team, our school, and our students, signaling that the relation itself had become the acting subjects. Sunho said, regardless of the project's appeal, if it doesn't serve our students, we just drop it. Only this we-centered dialogue produced a we subject that later propelled the team to a National Curriculum Innovation Award. Much like the two dancers who move not as two coordinated individuals, but as a unified whole, this relational unity of a we constitutes a qualitatively distinct form of agency. Relational we agency cannot be reduced to individual intentions of personal agency or dyadic coordination of interpersonal agency. Relational reflexivity is not merely a dialogical practice between I and you, but a co-reflexive process emergent from we subjects that ethically orients itself toward the flourishing of the relation itself. There is a co-constituted moral intentionality, not merely moral responsiveness there. This is where a relation becoming reflexive and transformative in itself, creating an emergent we subject, while Archer's communicative reflexivity or Donati's interpersonal reflexivity is about an individual relying on the others to think, or the individual in interaction with the other. Next, please. Now, synthesis.
Around
Next,
5 minutes to go, so
Yeah.
no, just to let you know.
Yeah, therefore, agency is not just personal capacity, value for cognition, or an episodic phenomenon. Under CRRA, this study reconceptualized agency as a relationally emergent power rooted in reflexive engagements at multiple layers of social reality at personal, interpersonal, and relational level. Next. Consequently, in the refined model, the personal, interpersonal, and relational reflexivity and the emergent we subject are explicated as distinct causal mechanisms, unpacking not merely what agency is, but how and why it emerges. The model advances theoretical and practical contributions. Next, please. First, by adding social relation as a sui generis reality, CRRA resolves Archer and Donati's debates and avoids collapsing reflexivity into individual mental ability. Second, it clarifies how reflexive modes trigger distinct causal pathways, explaining why some collaborative initiatives plateau while others evolve. Importantly, collaboration does not automatically equal relational agency. Practically, efficient task sharing may reflect only interpersonal alignment, whereas relational agency requires a deliberately cultivated we relation that orients action toward the good of the relation itself. Third, relational agency foregrounds first-person plural ethics, positioning education as a moral practice oriented toward relational goods. Next, a final remark. Agency arises not only in individuals or between individuals, but also through and by social relations themselves. Recognizing this layered, ethically attuned, relationally emergent power of human agency reorients research in the sociology of education toward the relational order of social reality, such as often overlooked dynamics of reflexivity, the depth and quality of social relationships, and the ethical commitment through human agency meaningfully emerges. Many thanks for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sung-Ho. Do we go on to the microphone, a different microphone for any questions in the room? So we've got around 10 minutes now for questions. I see Michelle has a hand up there and Jeremy. So maybe we start with online participants first. So Michelle, whenever you're ready.
Hi, many thanks for that really, really interesting piece. I found fascinating. Just a quick question. How come you went for Donati as opposed to Bhaskar Meld as a way of dealing with Archer's individualism? Did you consider Bhaskar Meld approach to meta reality?
I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not into Bhaskar.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So Jeremy.
Hi there, Sung-Ho. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked your concluding remark. I think some of the things you said in your presentations really resonate with how I understand, relational reflexivity and so forth. There are just a few sort of conceptual issues that I maybe you could take note of, or maybe react now if you're able and willing to. You said that Archer overlooks the relational aspect of agency, and that, on the other hand, Donati does. But then you referred to the 2015 book by Donati and Archer, The Relational Subject, which they collaborate together and they really develop this idea at quite great depth. So I'm not actually quite sure if there's such a contrast between Archer's work on agency and Donati's work on the relational subject. Just hold on, I just want to finish that point. I think it's important to understand that the 2015 publication by both these authors actually took a lot from Archer's well-developed distinction between self-actors, primary agents, and corporate agents, which was done like in 1995 and so forth, in 2000 and so forth. And it does provide a pretty strong conceptual basis for the work done in the 2015 books, particularly how those two authors developed the relational reflexivity and the relational subject. So I have two questions, so I'll give you a chance to respond to that first.
Actually, when I read the relational subject written in 2015, I found that they collaborate with each other. After that, I found that their thinking went in divergent ways. Recently, Donati publicly not criticized, but pinpoint the limitation of Archer, and he develops based on the self, the primary agent, corporate, that the picture, and he developed this with the relational gaze, and then I found that the concept of we of Archer is different from Donati's. I think the corporate agency of we is somewhat instrumental, or for the individuals, its individual point of view from Archer. It's for social movement, because she's a sociologist, and it's for the discrete issues like the social inclusion or something like that. But for Donati, we is good in itself. It is for the we subjects acts for the good of the relationship itself. It is the aim itself. So relational goods is very important, and then they in the interaction, they do not take person as an instrumental resources like in the chat theory. They unintentionally treat people as resources for school improvement or policy mandates.
Yeah.
But Donati says that no, relationship is different from social interaction. It's like just a direct interaction for something, for the purpose given by policy mandates or something, but it cherishes the relationship with the others, and they cherish the relationship with our students, the relations with students, because
I think I sympathize with what you're saying. I don't agree with your critique fully, but I sympathize with, and I know where you're coming from, and correct me if I'm wrong. I live in Japan. I've been working in Japan for 27 years. What you're talking about, I think, is a sort of a culturally imbued sort of understanding of social relationships, which is not necessarily clear in the works of Archer and Donati. I understand that part. I actually have the same critique. I would say that a lot of Archer's work actually is quite European in that sense. It doesn't really ring a bell among Japanese students, for example. So I understand that part. But my point was just to say that I'm not sure that your original critique was well-grounded, because what preceded that 2015 book actually in Archer's writing did quite provide, I'm not sure if there was such a dichotomy between those two authors. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Yeah. There's another conceptual issue that I wanted to bring your attention to. You emphasized the we interaction. Now that's interesting, but at the same time, I'm not sure if it brings conceptual sophistications, because it seems to avoid the, I think, necessary the pre-existence of the self upon which social norms can be impinged. I mean, if somebody is going to be able to relate to other people, whether Korean, whether Japanese, whether British or from Switzerland, or it doesn't matter the cultural origin of the human being we're talking about. If somebody is able to relate to another human being and read those social norms and follow or challenge those social norms, surely there must be some kind of self upon which all of this information must be sort of like, must enter and be processed through. So I don't see, if you're going to say we interaction, I'm just going to ask you the question, where is the I in there?
That's a good question. It goes to the ontology then. I think what Donato wants to distinguish is the interaction order of reality. IU interaction is different from I in relation of we. This is different. And I think the concept of norms are different here as well. Actually, Parsons, according to Parsons' agile scheme, there's a norm there. It's given by the institute. But Donati says that if we constructed the relations, they themselves create their own norms. Like, we just don't talk about it if it's not benefits our students. They make their own norms. In there, I am willing to surrender the norms because I agree to benefit of our students. That happens to the narrow school. Do you know what I mean? So we is like I is alive, but not I intervene to the I, and Donati says that identity issues, and it's like I equal reflexive relations between I and not I. That I is alive, but it surpasses me, transcends me, because not I is involved in.
Yeah, but the act of surpassing, though, does not does not erase the I.
No,
when
never.
you surpass
never.
something, you build upon
I
the
is there.
I, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is a good conversation for you guys to carry on afterwards. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I see Michelle has a hand up there. There's no questions in the among the in-person participants, so I think if we pass over to Michelle again for the last question.
Apologies, my hand shouldn't have been up. Apologies.
Oh, right. Well, yeah, I think it sounds like you guys should definitely carry on the conversation either at the end of this session today or at some point, because you've definitely got lots to discuss. And I also had a question, Sunko, about sort of the original modes of reflexivity that Archer identified, and why you hadn't focused on them. If you have a quick answer, then you could go now, but otherwise it may be something to talk about at the end of my presentation, because I've looked at the original modes that Archer identified, so maybe you could see what I say and then respond to that question later in my question time.
Okay, later then.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you also for actually finishing ahead of time, so you had extra time for questions. So yeah, another round of applause for Sunko. And next up, so we have Jan next. We're just loading up Jan's slides. Again, it'll be 20 minutes for the presentation. I'll let you know when there's around 5 minutes to go, and then we'll have questions at the end again. Okay, and there's the clicker if you want to use that. I think it's still working okay. Okay, over to you, Jan.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Yan Wang from the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. It's my great honor to present here today on how a critical realism lens can help us understand teacher education as a complex and a context-sensitive system. This presentation is based on my article-based dissertation, which includes 2 published papers and 1 under review. In recent decades, teacher education has been widely seen as one of the most significant drivers of educational improvement and broader societal development. However, research in this area remains fragmented. Studies often isolate structural reforms, individual practice, or cultural influences. This fragmentation hinders the development of a comprehensive understanding of teacher education, limiting our ability to explain how teacher education systems evolve over time, how professional agency is shaped within specific contexts, and why reforms succeed or fail. To address this, I turn to critical realism. My dissertation applies critical realism as both a theoretical lens and a methodological approach to examine the dynamic interplay of culture, structure, and teacher-educator agency within pre-service teacher education. My aim is both theoretical and empirical. Theoretically, I propose a critical realism-informed conceptual framework that understands teacher education through layered, interacting, generative mechanisms. Empirically, I apply this framework to comparative case studies of teacher education in Finland and China to test and refine the proposed framework. Draw on Maxwell's distinction between the physical and mental aspects of reality, alongside Tickley's emphasis on the laminated system. A teacher education quadrant is developed, which distinguishes between culture, structure, belief, and practice as analytically distinct but interrelated aspects of teacher education. In this study, at the collective level, culture is interpreted as national education traditions and value systems. For example, Confucianism in China and the Beldon tradition in Finland. Structure refers to both national level frameworks that guide qualifications and curricula and the internal program level arrangements, such as program curricula and practicum structure. These are treated together as structural features because they interact to constitute space for agency. At the individual level, agency captures the agent's capacity to navigate, interpret, and act upon their structural and cultural environments. Here, agency is expressed through individual teacher-educator belief and practice. This study adopts teacher competence as a conceptual lens and empirical anchors to explore what culture, structure, agency, and their interaction ultimately aim to influence in teacher education. Based on that teacher education quadrant and also drawing on Archer's morphogenesis cycles, a conceptual framework is developed to illustrate the interplay among culture, structure, and agency in teacher education. In this model, culture is understood to shape both institutional structure and individual agency, while structure and agency also reshape cultural patterns through recursive interaction. Structures constrain and enable teacher educators' agency in developing student-teachers' competencies, while teacher educators may maintain or modify those structures through belief and practice. While structures and practices may be directly observable, beliefs, cultural norms, and cultural mechanisms often operate below the surface, shaping what is seen and done. This interplay is not general or universal, but inherently local and context-specific, which implies that natural guidelines, institutional configurations, individual responses and their interactions vary across settings. This leads to a critical realist-informed comparative design. Comparative research, when informed by a critical realist orientation, is not limited to the identification of differences and similarities. Rather, it seeks to uncover how cultural structure and agency interact to generate context-specific yet potentially transfactual mechanism. A diverse case logic guided the selection of two contrasting systems, Finland and China, so that causal mechanism could be examined across the wide relevant range. Finland teacher education relatively small, decentralized, and built on influence. And the China teacher education is large, centralized, and Confucianism influenced. As in this figure, I started from the top, the proposed teacher education conceptual framework, and then going down, abduction involves redescribing empirical patterns through critical realism concepts. Well, retroduction traced deeper causal explanations. The goal here is not to generalize statistically, but to analytically generalize, to refine the proposed conceptual framework by showing how the same kind of mechanism take different forms in different cases. My data set includes policy documents, program materials, and teacher educator interviews. I identified 3 components from the composed teacher education quadrant we discussed just now, and that are directly relevant to the data, including structure, belief, and practice. Policy documents provide data on the national structure of teacher education. The program materials represent official program level structures. The interview focused on the belief and practice of teacher educators to explore how they exert their agency. I integrate critical realism with qualitative content analysis to examine teacher education phenomena through a context-sensitive and a layered analysis of textual data, aiming to identify plausible and comprehensive causal mechanisms. This coding structure organized codes into mental and physical domains. The coding process followed a 2-cycle logic. First cycle identifies structural and agential elements linked to enablement, constraint, enhancement, compensation, or relevance to culture. Besides that, inspired by critical discourse analysis, I'm also interested in social relations and social identity. The second cycle traced how and why structural agent and culture interact in certain patterns in specific contexts. This layered coding approach allowed me to link observed practices to deeper generative mechanisms. In critical realism, structure is seen as stratified and emergent, shaped by past actions, yet conditioning future possibilities. In my study, I find Finnish teacher education operates within a decentralized structure, offering institutional flexibility and space for innovation. However, this can lead to fragmentation, particularly in practicum integration and program coherence. Chinese teacher education, by contrast, is governed by centralized national structures that ensure consistency and alignment. However, this same coherence can limit local responsiveness and constrain innovation. Despite these differences, structures in both contexts function as causal powers. They shape but do not determine the field of possible actions. This opens space for agency. Agency in critical realism is emergent. It arises through the interplay between individuals and the cultural structural conditions they inhabit. In Finland, teacher educators exert agency through curriculum interpretation, pedagogical innovation, taking on roles as researchers, curriculum designers, and reformers. In China, despite tighter constraints, educators express agency through ethical mentoring, local adaptations of policy, embedding moral values into standardized instruction. In both contexts, agency is not just reactive, but reflective and value-driven. Teacher educators actively shape their roles, curricula, and practices in ways that engage and mediate structural conditions. Culture in this research is treated as a semi-autonomous systems of meaning that shapes and is shaped by institutional and individual practice. Both Finnish and Chinese programs share a belief in educating a whole being, yet this belief takes distinct forms. Finnish educators emphasize autonomy and well-being, drawing on built-on didactic to support reflective, student-centered pedagogy. Chinese educators prioritize moral formation and collective responsibility, grounded in Confucian ethics that guide ethical modeling and national purpose. Culture thus influences not only what counts as good education, but also how educators understood their roles and responsibility. It mediates belief, informs practice, and gives meanings to structural constraints and possibilities. As Andrew Sayers argued, context is not merely a background condition, but an integral part of cultural processes. In this study, both culture and structure are understood not as passive backdrops, but as active cultural forces that participate in shaping the process of teacher education. Now we turn to how culture, structure, and agency interact dynamically within teacher education systems. Let's look at this table from left column to right. In the Finnish cases, at a cultural level, the built-on didactic tradition prioritizes autonomy, well-being, and lifelong learning. This is structurally supported through coherent program frameworks, optional and reflective courses, and a research-based orientation. These structures enable educators to take on multiple active roles as researchers, curriculum designers, and equity facilitators. Teacher educators draw on these cultural and structural resources to enact reflexive student-centered practices. But the interplay isn't always smooth. There are tensions, such as fragmented practicum arrangements or decontextualized research expectations, which educators compensate for by reinterpreting curriculum demands. This illustrates feedback loops. Cultural values shape structure, which shapes agency, which in turn reinforce or reshape both. In contrast, the Chinese cases reveals a different configuration. Confucian ethics shapes the cultural purpose of teacher education as moral and social responsibility. This cultural logic is supported by strong national structures, including detailed teacher competence standards and systematic coordinated practicum. Educators are positioned as ethical role models operating within a practice-oriented systems. But while structure here ensure coherence, it can also limit critical thinking and innovation. Teacher educators respond by drawing on cultural values and institutional norms to mediate constraints. For example, by contributing to local practicum design or infusing ethical reasoning into policy-driven instruction. This reflects what criticalism calls compensatory agency, working within constraints but not being determined by them. In summary, this study has found 4 interactive features among culture, structure agency in the teacher education cases. Number one, dialectical interaction. We can see structure constraint may be constrained some of the agency, but agent compensate for the program weakness. Number two, often contradictory interaction. For example, the structure enabling some competencies and maybe at the same time constrain other competencies. Number three, multiple mediation. It could be vertical, like we talked about just now, from the macro culture to institutional and then to individual. And also it could be horizontal or internal. For example, within individual level, belief-oriented practice and practice in turn enact belief. And also it could be trans-level. For example, the individual action may reshape macro-level culture. Number four, context-sensitive interaction. The next two figures will illustrate context-sensitive interactive patterns adapted from the general teacher education model proposed earlier. In Finland, interplay is driven by decentralization and build-on, foster autonomous agency and curricular freedom. In China, interplay is framed by Confucian ethics and a centralized alignment, foster moral responsibility and coordination. In conclusion, this research developed a refined theoretical framework for explaining teacher education as a stratified relational phenomenon. Moreover, rather than offering a one-size-fits-all model, Finnish and Chinese cases explain how culture, structure, and agency operate together in context-sensitive ways. From this study, three key implications emerge. Teacher education should be treated as a relational phenomenon where culture, structure, and agency influence one another continuously. Agency is mediation, not implementation. Teachers are not merely executors of policy, but active participants in shaping it. Policy must reflect contextual complexity. Transplanting systems without understanding their cultural and structural roots risks unintended consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. And again, well done for finishing ahead of time. Do we have any questions either online or in person? We have a hand up here immediately, so over to you. I'll just ask you the stuff.
I find that really interesting from a number of perspectives.
Thank you.
And yeah, what I wanted to ask you is that with our world changing, globalization, and I know I've had Chinese students come and stay with me in Australia, and I've had colleagues go and teach in China. So with that globalization, where teachers don't come from that culture, do you see that there'll be an evolution in expected outcomes, or you talked about the moral importance of a teacher education. So if you've got an Australian teacher where we're a little bit different, do you see that they'll, and Australian, but we are in an age of globalization, that that's going to change the education outcomes?
Yeah, I don't know whether I can understand immediately, perfectly to your question. But here I mentioned teacher competence as a relatively globalized trend, basically from the Western model. And for example, competence from United States or from UK. And I have to say this globalization has influenced many countries, including Finland, China. And so both of them, they have in some way integrate competence into their teacher education curriculum. But they are not just a ticket for all. It is in detail talk about that in my first and second article. For example, both of them, they reject the instrumental aspects of competence. They think teaching is, the purpose of teaching is still more important than all of the techniques and the tools. So both of them, they selectively choose some of the competences relevant to their context. And also, besides that, they use their cultures integrated into this trend. For example, they will highlight their purpose of teaching. In China will be the Confucianism, everything will, the moral purpose of teaching will be over all of the techniques or application of competence. And then the Finnish cases, they use the well-being as a very important, or the holistic development, and to educate the whole being as the umbrella of this whole competence adaptation. So all of the competence, these application will be under the umbrella term of a holistic being in Finnish cases. So I think under this globalization trend, including competences, but not limited to that, and all of the countries within this world has been influenced this way or that way, more or less. But I think just take it uncritically maybe is not a reasonable way. And we learn from these two countries, both of them, they just have to apply everything within their own context.
Thank you. It's really interesting.
Thank you. I see Michelle has a question online now.
Yeah, apologies. I can't get the hand to come down. Apologies. Fabulous talk, though. Really interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, so you don't have a question, right? So you can't get a hand down. I see.
Yeah,
right.
no, apologies. It was a fabulous presentation. Thank you. But there's an issue here with me. Sorry, apologies.
No problem. Any questions for anyone else online? Anyone else in the room?
But maybe I can respond in some way to the Dr. Lee's presentation. Thank you very much for the very insightful research about agency, especially based on the settings of South Korea and from the Eastern perspective. And in some way, I think our research complement with each other because my research is based on one from the Eastern, the culture or the structure, and another one is from China, the Eastern culture, one from West, one from East. And just now we talk about I and we. And also I talk about that in my second article. So according to Chinese Confucianism, so they prefer collective responsibility. So it means the bigger units is more important or more significant than the smaller unit. For example, country this we is more important than family this we, and more important than I. So we do have I, but I maybe let's take the class students as example. I here more in Chinese cases more relational role in this we environment. So we do have I, but maybe let's say compare with my two cases, both of them they talk about adaptive teaching to adapt the teaching to the needs of the students. But relatively here the students, the Finnish cases will more adapted to individual students' needs. For example, the special needs students, individual. But in China, they adapt more general to the most of the students, to the we situation. And then besides that, if they still have energy or have time or space, and they will focus on more individual. They have a different prioritize in my study.
Any other questions? I have a question about, do you feel like there are any sort of key limitations in the framework you've used? Obviously, in some of the other presentations, we've heard about people talking about, moving Archer's concepts forward and Bhaskar. I wondered if in your research, you feel there's any obvious areas where, further development might be needed?
You mean my
Yeah, in
framework?
terms
Yeah.
of the concepts you've used and framework, and whether you feel like there are any notable gaps. There might not be, but I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you for your question. Here, I have to admit, using criticalism for me is a really bumpy journey because most of the researchers, they just mainly focus on one factors, but I want to look at a comprehensive, more wider picture. It do give me, bring me a lot of difficulty. So I just choose currently three most important culture, structure, and agency. And in agency, I just choose teacher educator as a very important representative here. But I have to say, because of the complexity of this criticalism, in teacher education, teacher educators or teacher education cannot decide everything. For example, student teachers as a very important agent, I don't have space to talk about that. And also, besides this structure, I talk about the policy, talk about program curriculum. But besides that, now we know, just like we hear from the other panels, we also talk about, it involves some political, economic, or the labor market, or labor resources, or some other factors are also very important. So I think in the future, maybe the other researchers or my further research could in some way complement with the current one.
Thank you. Okay, unless anyone has any further quick questions, we'll have another round of applause for you, please. That's me. Thank you. Okay, so I'm up next, and I'll try and keep myself to time as well as you guys have done. So we're at the halfway point now, just two more to go. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my my PhD research and sort of what I've been doing since that sort of builds on that. So my PhD I submitted and finished last year. So the stuff I'm talking about, as I said, it derives from that, but hopefully towards the end of the presentation builds on that too. So my PhD research, broadly speaking, was about student experiences of higher education and why some students have better experiences whilst they're at university than others. Now, obviously, that's a big topic, and lots of things influence student experiences whilst they're at university. So my specific focus was on how the decision-making processes of students can influence the quality of their experiences. So looking at different ways that students make decisions and whether some of those patterns are sort of more conducive to better student experiences than others. So that was sort of one of my core research questions starting out. And this is where I became interested in Archer's work on reflexivity. So I know some of you will already be familiar with this, but I always like to make no prior assumptions. And so, yeah, as I said, I became interested in Archer's framework of reflexivity, and this was because it gave me a way to analyse the decision-making processes of students. So as I said, as many of you will know, reflexivity from Archer's perspective, it was quoted earlier, is basically our ability to consider ourselves in relation to our context and vice versa. And when I'm describing it, I always go a bit more specific and say that, to me, reflexivity is our ability to make conscious decisions. It's our ability to think about our options, to weigh things up, and to make conscious choices. Now, originally, I know that the presentation earlier looked at sort of additional forms of reflexivity, but initially and originally the modes, Archer identified 4 different modes of reflexivity. Now there may be more, but these were the ones that Archer identified originally and the ones that I've focused on. First of which is communicative reflexivity. So this is where, when we're making a decision, we like to talk to somebody else, see what somebody else thinks, and have the input of another person or more than one person before making decisions. So it's sort of thinking and talking and then deciding. Autonomous reflexivity is in many ways the opposite of that. So that's where we think about our options and we make a choice without directly consulting another person. Archer also identified meta-reflexivity, which I would say is the most reflective of the modes of reflexivity. So this is where when we're making our decisions and considering what to do, we think more broadly about the implications of our decisions. So, you know, what might be the implications for myself further down the line? How might my choices influence other people, perhaps the planet? It's really, I'd say, meta-reflexivity or through meta-reflexivity that we're able to think ethically. Finally, Archer identified fractured reflexivity, which isn't really a mode of reflexivity as such. It's more what happens when reflexivity doesn't work. So if you think of times when you've had a decision to make and the more you've thought about it, the more you've felt sort of distressed and disoriented and unable to make a decision, that's basically what is meant by fractured reflexivity. So I think a couple of important things to note at this point are people can, and I would say we do, use these modes regularly, perhaps every day. So we're not fixed to one mode. However, Archer's research did suggest that people can have what she called a dominant mode, where a mode of reflexivity or a specific mode more or less becomes a way of being for a person. Now, in my research, I wasn't really looking at modes of reflexivity as ways of being. I was more interested in how much the students tend to use each of these modes. And linking back to that original question about student experiences, are some modes of reflexivity more conducive to better student experiences than others? That was kind of my question. I was interested in linking these different modes, firstly trying to measure how much students tend to use them, and then linking them to student experiences more broadly. So to analyse relationships between the modes of reflexivity and the student experiences, I didn't actually get data on student experiences. What I did instead was looked at relationships between these modes of reflexivity on the one hand and different kinds of motivations on the other. So I was not only asking, it's a quantitative study, by the way, so I created some new measures of these modes of reflexivity. Some of you will be aware that Archer did create some measures herself, but I actually found in another PhD that was sort of published since Archer's work on this, there were some validity issues with the measures that Archer created. So I tried to address those findings by creating some new measures in my PhD. And as I said, I was looking at relationships between the different modes of reflexivity, so patterns in decision making, and now as I've come on to the motivations of students too, so the why they go to university. So there's sort of 2 important theoretical aspects to my research. There's Archer's framework of reflexivity on the one hand, but there's also self-determination theory on the other hand, which comes from psychology. And it conceptualizes different forms of human motivation and looks at sort of how those different kinds of motivation are related to human well-being, basically. So broadly speaking, there's 3 main types of motivation that self-determination theory identified. It should make sense, hopefully, to you all. Intrinsic motivation is where we feel like we wholeheartedly want to do something regardless of any external incentive. So it could be, I want to read this book just because I genuinely feel like it. I want to go to this music concert because I genuinely feel like it. Some of you might have felt intrinsically drawn towards this particular panel today. But intrinsic motivation is basically where we feel like we wholeheartedly want to do something and we're not really being motivated by any external factor. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is where we are motivated by extrinsic factors or external factors. So if students are extrinsically motivated, for example, they'll say things like, I come to university because I want to get a well-paid job, or I come to university because my parents made me feel like I should, or I come to university because my friends are doing it and I wanted to stick with them. Finally, there's amotivation, which is where motivation is pretty much non-existent. So in my research, students who are amotivated say things like, I don't know why I come to university and I wonder whether I should continue. So from self-determination theory, we know pretty much what we'd expect, that when people are intrinsically motivated, they tend to enjoy the things they're doing more. So if you felt intrinsically motivated to come to this session today for some particular reason, it's more likely that you'll enjoy it while you're here. Not guaranteed, but more likely. Extrinsic motivation, it can enhance our experiences. So if, for example, a student comes to university because they want to try and improve society, you could say that's an extrinsic motivation. That's likely to enhance their experiences of being at university and the activities they get involved in. However, if the extrinsic motivation is, for example, as I said, my parents made me feel like I should do it, so it was kind of pressure from external factors, those kind of extrinsic motivations can undermine our experiences of the things we do. So with extrinsic motivation, it's more complicated in terms of how it's likely to influence our experiences when we do things. Amotivation, as you'd expect, is associated with not enjoying things, not finding fulfillment in things, as we'd expect really from the way I described it. So in my PhD, as I've already said, I looked at relationships between those different modes of reflexivity that I outlined earlier and these different forms of motivation that I've just summarised there. Here are some of my key findings. First one is basically that meta-reflexivity and intrinsic motivation are positively related among students, according to my PhD findings. So in other words, the more reflective students are when they make decisions, the more they think about the broader implications of their decisions, the more likely they are to feel intrinsically motivated, the more likely they are to say things like, I come to university because I genuinely love to learn. I come to university because I'm genuinely interested in the subject. The opposite is true with meta-reflexivity and amotivation. The more reflective students are, the less likely they are to feel amotivated, the less likely they are to say, I don't know why I come to university and I wonder whether I should continue. There was another positive correlation though, and that was with fractured reflexivity and amotivation. So the more students struggle to make decisions, the more they find that when making decisions, they tend to feel distressed and disoriented, and the more unable to sort of make plans they feel, the more likely they are to be amotivated. So that's a positive positive correlation there. So, what are the implications of these findings? Well, this suggests that meta-reflexivity appears to be more conducive to positive student experiences than fractured reflexivity, because as I've said, the more meta-reflexivity students tend to use, according to my findings, the more likely they are to feel intrinsically motivated. Whereas the opposite is the case with fractured reflexivity. So this suggests that more meta-reflexivity among students is a good thing, and less fractured reflexivity among students is a good thing. Again, I think these are things we'd intuitively expect to find. But I want to move on now to what I'm working on in an article I'm hoping to submit soon, about basically, so how should we try and influence reflexivity then among students? I think I'd start here just by saying that although my findings suggest that meta-reflexivity among students is positively associated with intrinsic motivation, and this is likely to be therefore a good thing, I think that doesn't mean that more meta-reflexivity will always be better, because if we think about it, more meta-reflexivity is likely to lead to fractured reflexivity. So, you know, if you're thinking about which panel to come today, you might have thought, well, I'm interested in that one, but then I've got a friend in the other one, I might want to go and support them. Or what if I go to this one, such and such might think ill of me. So the more you think about things, the harder it can become to make a decision. But as a rule of thumb, in general, my finding, I would say that, you know, more meta-reflexivity among students is likely to be a good thing. With fractured reflexivity, I would say, although continual fractured reflexivity isn't a good thing for people and for students, small bits of it might be good. So if we think about when we're writing or preparing our presentations, we often get stuck and we don't know what to do. And then we think about it more, and then we think, well, the more I'm thinking about it, the harder it seems. I think that can be a necessary part of our intellectual and personal development. So I'd say that although my findings suggest that fractured reflexivity, you know, I'd say continual fractured reflexivity isn't a good thing. Some fractured reflexivity probably is a good thing, and then, as I said, a necessary part of our sort of intellectual and personal development, whether we're students or people in the world. So moving on, well, or sticking with that question then of how should we influence student reflexivity? There's another part of self-determination theory that I think gives us some clues about how, at least in higher education, we should try and influence student reflexivity. And in short, the idea I'm putting forward is that we should be trying to influence students' reflexivity in ways that support their basic psychological needs. So it's 3 more key concepts to give you here. And as I said, these come from self-determination theory. And the idea is that, like our basic physiological needs for food or for water, we also have basic psychological needs that are they're innate and necessary for our well-being, regardless of whether we value them or not. Now, self-determination theory has identified 3 of these basic psychological needs, which they sort of can explain theoretically from an evolutionary perspective, but they've also done lots of research to test and see that these needs seem to be cross-cultural as well. First need is the need for autonomy. That's the need to feel like, you know, I want to do the things that I'm doing and that I'm in the driving seat, so to speak. I'm able to make choices and not feel like I'm doing the things I do just because someone is making me feel that way. Second need, a basic psychological need, is the need for competence. So that's the need to feel like what I'm doing, whether it's sitting in a presentation like this or for a student studying a particular degree, it's the need to feel like it's not so easy that it's boring to me, but it's not so difficult that I can't comprehend any of it. So that's the second basic psychological need. Finally, there's relatedness, which is the need to feel a sense of belonging in the things that we're doing and in the places we are, among the people we're around, and to feel sort of meaningfully related to whatever it is that we're doing or we're thinking about. Now, I'm arguing, I mean, it's first worth pointing out that if the question comes up of how do we influence motivations, how do we make people feel intrinsically motivated, from a self-determination theory perspective, the answer is to support people's basic psychological needs, to find ways to support these needs. I'm arguing that applies to human reflexivity too. So if we want to influence students' reflexivity or our own reflexivity in certain ways, we need to try and do it in ways that support these needs. I think that will also help us and students avoid this feeling of fractured reflexivity. So I think that the question of how do we end up experiencing fractured reflexivity, I think it does relate to these needs. Perhaps you don't feel competent enough, perhaps what you might be doing what sort of constrains your feeling of relatedness to perhaps the people that might be implicated by your decisions. So in the paper I'm working on at the minute, I'm putting forward 3 guiding principles. The first one is, as I've just said, approaches to influencing student reflexivity should support students' basic psychological needs. Now, although these basic psychological needs are universal, is the assumption here, they can be supported in many different ways, and what might support one person's basic psychological needs might not support another. So you could have a student sat in a class and they feel like their psychological needs are supported implicitly. But as we know, another student might not be having a good time with it, might not be enjoying it. So that comes to my second guiding principle, which is that our approaches must be flexible. They must be able to flexible and adaptable enough so that we can sort of tailor them to students' needs, but also the student can tailor our approaches as educators to their own unique profile, and you could say that also their own different reflexivity tendencies. And that's the final bit I wanted to mention here, is that I often thought, as I put it earlier, the question in my head for a long time was, you know, which mode of reflexivity is best for student experiences. But I don't think it's as straightforward as that. As I've already said, I think in general, meta-reflexivity is to be facilitated among students, but it's not always the case that more of that is going to be better. And I think, as Archer's research shows, people have different, what I call reflexivity tendencies. So some people might have a dominant mode, some people might use very little of a certain mode. So I think whatever we're doing, we need to be taking that that assumption, that fact, I would say, based on Archer's evidence and other research. We need to take into account that idea that, you know, people have different reflexivity tendencies. So we've got to try and, rather than focus on a specific mode, which we might need to do to empower a person's reflexivity, I think we always need to have a sense of that we're trying to empower or influence a person's reflexivity as a whole. So taking into account not just one of the modes, but the other modes too. 1 minute to go. So I'll just give a quick mention of these other more practical suggestions that I sort of work with in my own practices as a university lecturer, and that might be worth other people thinking about too. They're not based on, I haven't empirically tested them, but they kind of derive from my understanding of the theories that I've been working with, and things I've worked out through my PhD research that I think seem to work to me. And the first one is, you know, just asking students, why are you here? Especially at the beginning of their degrees. I think a lot of students at my university, at least, haven't thought as seriously about that question as you might think. And I think by just inviting students to think about it, we get them being more reflective, more meta-reflexive, but we also get them to be hopefully to find more intrinsic motivation. And I think to help with that, you know, sharing our stories as educators can go a long way too, because as we know, when we're younger, when we're starting out, we see people who might be a lecturer or a professor and sort of think, well, they always wanted to do that, but as we know, it's not usually the case. So I think that sort of sharing our stories with students can not only give them more to think about, but help them to be more motivated, because they can see possibilities that perhaps they weren't already aware of. And I think sort of learning about their initial interests, which is really back to the suggestion one, that can help us too, whether it's, you know, in big groups that I work with, it might be at the beginning, we ask students for a quantitative response, you know, what are you interested in about sociology, in my case, what motivates you? And I kind of try and use that so that when I'm teaching, I link my examples to things that they've given me, which, you know, linking back to those basic psychological needs. I think that's one way we can make students feel more related to what we're talking about. So yeah, I'll leave it there because I've just hit my 20-minute mark and I don't want to take up any extra time. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and look forward to any questions and feedback. So do we have questions? We have two in the room, so we'll start here. Whose hand went up first? Sorry, your hand. Oh, we need the microphone, and I'm the microphone man.
Very much for that. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I was curious as to when you did your study, what did you focus on in year level, like when you were asking about their?
Yeah, so in the end, it was taking whatever I could get, because I had to do my research during the pandemic. Mostly it was first year undergraduate students, and they were the intended respondents because they were at the beginning of their degrees. So yeah, I think there were 336 students in my sample. And it's important for me to say that it wasn't a representative sample, so we have to be cautious about my findings. I've explained that in my PhD, but there's only so much we can build in here. But yeah, there was 336 students, most of which were first year undergraduates, but some of them were further on in that.
The reason I asked is that I did a study on adult learner needs, and one of the things that came out was the need to know yourself and how you learn. And it seemed to relate very closely to the reflexivity. And yeah, when the students got to know how they learned and what was required from assessments and you know, which took time, some of them said it took at least a year, then they could settle in and enjoy the university experience. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's an important comment about just help, and it links again to the, well, you could say the need for relatedness and the need for competence, and dovetailing now, because if students are feeling like, yeah, well, I'm finding my way, I can make it, I can cope, then that will be the need for competence being supported, and perhaps through the things you were talking about, that was helped by them feeling more related too. I think all these concepts that I'm working with are capable of influencing one another. So yeah, thank you for those comments. Another question in the room.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this talk. I'm also a teacher at university level.
Right.
I was also, so what you said in your like especially resonated a lot with me, so that I'm doing also in the classroom. I get to that also that you actually show reflexivity, that you as a teacher are also reflective.
Yeah,
in the
good
classroom
point.
and kind of role.
Yeah.
My question was then rather also get the same direction from the students you were servicing with on about what disciplines are we talking here with students? Are they sociology students?
Yeah.
Or different students? Because I'm working in a really interdisciplinary context, natural science, also social science, and I have the feeling that in different disciplines, reflexivity has different value. In some disciplines, reflexivity is not valued at all, it's completely absent if you want.
Yeah.
In social sciences and humanities, they are much more used to reflexivity, and maybe you can have them also suggestions for different disciplines have fostered reflexivity.
Great questions, and these are great questions for me, bringing out the bits that I purposefully left out in the presentation. So it was a sample based primarily on sociology and criminology students. There's some education students. So that's another reason why it's a non-representative sample of students in general. I do think it'd be the case that students will have different reflexivity tendencies in different subjects. I haven't got any evidence on that. That's definitely, if I was in my Viva now, I'd say was beyond the scope of my thesis, but it's definitely one of the first things I'd suggest we need more, or we need some research on, to look at how reflexivity among students in different subjects. A large part of my PhD was about creating some new measures of these different modes and testing whether they seem to work or not in terms of validity and reliability. But yeah, I didn't get to looking beyond the sociology and criminology students. But the idea of those recommendations I've made at the end, particularly, well, both the general sort of guiding principles, but also those more specific practical recommendations. The idea is that these could be applicable in any disciplines. So it's just as worthwhile, as far as I'm concerned, to ask maths or physics students why they come to university as it is to ask the sociology students. So yeah, the idea and what I'm trying to do at the minute is try and make some recommendations that can be applicable to all students. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. And we have Jeremy online now with his hand up.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation. There's just it was a very good presentation, very interesting, very insightful, and I think your research is seems to be quite well constructed. I just want to bring your attention to just a few things about what you said, which to me reveal underlying assumptions about what reflexivity is, and to a broader extent, how reflexivity relates to how we understand agency to some extent. First of all, you seem to talk about meta-reflexivity very much in positive terms, but if you read Archer's work, she does tend to talk about meta-reflexivity as producing sort of a sense of dissatisfaction among meta-reflexive, and also specifically idealist modes of thinking, sort of. That was just one point that I noticed. I also noticed that you kind of linked a motivation or demotivation to fractured reflexivity, which to me, that link needs to be further conceptualized. I mean, people can be demotivated as a result of, you know, pretty clear thinking. Let's say, for example, the teacher is very bad. Like my teacher is, you know, like promotes these like outdated views in the classroom, and the class is really bad and everything. I am demotivated. That's not necessarily the product of fractured reflexivity. That's actually sort of a rational sort of mode of thinking that the teacher and the course are not of good quality. So that link needs to be further explored, I think. And I was more specifically sort of concerned about your use of the word more, the quality more reflexive, implying that there are other forms of, that there's less reflexivity also that is possible. So sort of reflexivity as something that you can quantify, that you can measure, more reflexive, less reflexive. To me, that view is I'm not saying that this is what you're doing. I don't think this is what you're doing, but it does conjure a culturally specific view of a human being who is, when able to demonstrate independence, he or she is more agentive or more reflexive, or more effective at using the reflexivity. And I wouldn't say that this is something that you would see everywhere around the world. Some cultures, you know, don't necessarily prioritize independence as much as maybe Archer has talked about in her books and everything. So these are three sort of conceptual issues that I thought maybe you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with everything you said. I think meta-reflexivity, as I said in the presentation, it's definitely not the case that the more the better. I think my findings are suggesting that, you know, and I think as we'd expect, you know, or as we sort of argue theoretically, you know, the more we get students to reflect whilst they're at university, you know, that's, you know, or getting them to reflect is likely to be a good thing. But as I said, I think, you know, one reason why more meta-reflexivity wouldn't always be better is because it can lead to fractured reflexivity. And I think, yeah, but to your second point about fractured reflexivity and amotivation, you know, I would have expected them to be some way related beforehand, but these are those relationships that I've put forward on the slide there. They're based on my empirical findings. But I think any relationship that I find, whilst there might be a general rule of thumb there, there'll always be exceptions to the rule. So I think that, you know, as I said earlier, fractured reflexivity, I think, can be seen, some element of it can be seen as an important part of intellectual development, in the sense of, like I said, when we're writing or something, you know, we get stuck, we don't feel able to move forward for a while. And as we know, we can get through that. And then I think that's where development occurs intellectually and personally. And then the final point was about the sort of conceptualizing people as more or less reflexive. Yeah, so I think, you know, in general, that there's a general sort of rule of thumb. You know, people, I would say some people are more reflexive than others, but it's not always a good thing. I think that links back to the point with meta-reflexivity. It might not be, as you said, Archer's research showed that her meta-reflexives are often, you know, not the most, you could say, happy, because they're pondering perhaps more questions, or perhaps deeper questions, than perhaps some of the other people that Archer had interviewed. For example, the autonomous reflexive is reflexive. So yeah, I think what I'm looking at are general patterns, and I'd say my measures, it's better to think of them as just indications, which is what Archer called her measures of reflexivity. She called it an internal conversation indicator. She was just trying to get a rough indication of, you know, how much do people tend to use these modes. And so yeah, I think I agree with what you were saying, and hopefully that response is consistent with it. But to me, what you said makes sense, and I think in my PhD I've accounted for that and framed it that way. How it came across in the short presentation, I don't know, but yeah, it'd be good to talk more about those kind of things though, because I'm still sort of thinking them through. And it's worth adding that the measures of autonomous and communicative reflexivity I created weren't so successful in terms of their validity and reliability, which is why we don't see any key findings on those modes here, but those modes obviously still exist. Right, it's just gone 12:30, so I see Sung Ho has a question, but maybe could you put that in the chat, Sung Ho, because I don't want to take up any more time. And I'm happy to chat to anyone at another point, especially online participants, so I won't get to see again today. But yeah, thank you all for your comments. And we're on to Michelle now, our final presenter. Thank you for waiting, Michelle. I do remember seeing you at another conference at some point. Was it The Hague, maybe?
It was The Hague. Were you in Birmingham last year as well? I remember seeing you as well, but it might have been The Hague, all right.
Yes, I was there. I've been there the last 3 years, so
yeah,
it's hard to remember where you've
year.
seen which people. But yeah, so it's over to you now, Michelle. Again, 20 minutes, and then we should have at least 10 minutes of questions at the end. We're just putting your slides up now.
I'm sharing it there. Can you see them?
Oh, yeah, we can see them. Great.
Yep.
Yes, so whenever you're ready,
Okay.
Michelle, I'll let you know when
Okay.
there's 5 minutes to go. Okay.
Perfect. I'm just going to set a timer because I am cognizant of the time, so apologies. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Michelle O'Keefe. I'm a PhD candidate in Ireland, and my PhD is entitled What's Worth Knowing? A critical realist qualitative study on what is considered knowledge amidst lower secondary education reform in Ireland. I am also a teacher. I do some part-time work with university. I lecture and I do a bit of supervision, but I'm predominantly teacher of English and politics as well. So what I kind of want to talk about today, it's not just about my findings, it's about my journey and about my journey with retroduction and how it affected me intellectually and personally. So the 7 steps or 7 kind of phases to this presentation, and I'll try and be as quick as I can. So framing, Ireland, like many other countries, is undergoing education reform currently, and for that reason it's obviously it's important to examine what that actually means. The junior cycle now in the literature said to be a hybridization of international ideologies and to represent one of the most significant changes in the approach to education in Ireland. So for that reason, I started delving into it, but the literature focuses predominantly on policy enactment, and it was very limited on the effect on curricular theory in general and extremely limited on epistemological and ontological perspectives. So the question was raised, what is considered knowledge and why it has emerged as it has. So my 2 research questions align with my 2 phases of empirical work. So my first question is, what's considered knowledge in the framework for junior cycle, which is the policy document that underpins the reform and why it emerged as it has. And the second one is, what is considered knowledge and how is it experienced in a specific school amidst education reform, and then what were the emergent mechanisms that allowed it to emerge. So the first phase was a critical realist discourse analysis on that framework, and the second one was qualitative inquiry in a Catholic voluntary secondary school. Now, the reason I chose a Catholic voluntary secondary school is because of my school of sight, and a Catholic school in Ireland isn't something that's privatised. The vast majority of the secondary schools in Ireland are Catholic. So I'll talk about that as the piece progresses. So in my early literature review, there was a lot of gaps and blocks and epistemic tensions, and it came to an awful lot of dead ends. So, for example, initially there was deep epistemological contradictions on what constitutes knowledge, who decides, is it universal, is it contextual? Do you know all these kind of things that Bhaskar talked about originally in his original work with critical realism? For example, even with the justified true belief model and the get-your problem, it showed that even analytical epistemology fails to secure any stable definitions. And in many ways, it reflected a wider ontological confusion, like what kind of being does this type of knowledge imply? So basically, literature and the literature then, or the literature on curriculum and the Irish education then reflect these tensions. There was a lot of discourses, powerful knowledge, constructivism, inclusion, but there wasn't really any resolution about these contradictions. So I reached a dead end intellectually and ontologically, and critical realism was already my chosen framework for different reasons that I won't go into today. But I actually found that it also allowed me a way to break through these contradictions that I was seeing in the literature on this topic, and it explained then the emergence of deeper structural issues. So, phase 1 of my study. What dominated from my finding of the critical realist discourse analysis of the framework was that there was a domination of rational empiricism. So there was formative feedback loops, evidence-based approach to policy norm, performative metrics, procedural propositional knowledge. You know, everything was about kind of, you know, self-regulation, constantly kind of changing yourself, constantly kind of reviewing yourself, and so on and so forth. There was constructivist elements to it, social and cognitive constructivism, but it was very much marred in kind of rational empirical modes of being. For example, it was data-driven constructivism, I would argue. Like, you had constructivism or constructivist approaches as a way to gather data to self-regulate, like regulate yourself or regulate your work or regulate your learning. Group work, for example, group work was written in the framework as a way to, you know, develop skills that you could use thereafter. It was individualistic, it wasn't, you know, fully kind of relational or anything like that. So knowledge was presented as well as fragmented and procedural, with little space for relationality or holistic formation. So there was well-being. Well-being is actually quite a big part of this reform, but the well-being is very much, again, I would argue, tied in with a rational empirical view of being, really. So, like, well-being is about, again, self-regulation, you know, getting yourself back up in it. You know, like, for example, even you know, school therapists or anyone that counsellors in the school, CBT is very much the place to go, because it's like the idea of getting back on with it, you know, fixing yourself and getting back, etc. So ontologically represented, I'm arguing, a neoliberal epistemology that deepens rational empiricism, individual rational economic agent, utilising empiricism to self-regulation and this fragmented knowledge. In many ways, it was written like a big science experiment. You know, the metrics were kind of created so that you regulate within this kind of enclosed way of being. So, and that's just the kind of the image that I have in my research. I won't go through, but that's kind of where I came to the idea that it was neoliberal epistemology. So this kind of leads me to the second phase, which is Archer's approach using structure, culture, and agency in the school. And I found this to be a kind of a difficult place to be in. Like I said, there was already tensions from the literature review. There was international assumptions about Catholicism. Like I said, like Catholicism or Catholic education in Ireland is very, very different to in other areas. It's very much tied in with identity and nationalism and all that kind of stuff as well. So from a cultural perspective, that was an issue. The church's role was both resisting colonialism and reproducing hierarchy, and a big question arose, how did we come to this? So there was an explicit and as well, I had a huge issue with how an explicit adaptation of neoliberal epistemology in the framework with the inferred ontology, how it was accepted when historically this had its roots in Indigenous oppression, you know, from colonial perspective. So they're the kind of areas that I was struggling with. So that was kind of this time last year. And at the time, then I got very sick. So literally we had the conference this time last year, and about a week later, I pulled a tick from my leg and I got Lyme meningitis. And it was a strange one because I was physically restricted. I got nerve damage in my right arm and I couldn't write or type for a very long time. I'm only back writing with about 2 months. But it actually emerged as a retroductive moment for me, and it allowed me to kind of personally, you know, walk, meditate, read, and to intellectual. And I'm arguing that it was a personal and intellectual crisis, but enabled new insight, and it allowed me to look at the problems I was seeing, and to kind of approach them with retrodiction, which I'll show on the next slide. So I'm arguing that illness created a space for me for reevaluation and philosophical repositioning. It was a dialectic of absence, so to speak. So when I am looking back at knowledge then, which is what I did in the midst of all of this year when I was sick, I was looking at the kind of the history of I suppose, state education in Ireland. So state education started in Ireland in 1831 with the national school system. It was a colonial institution because we were still, as a country, on colonial rule. And interestingly, it in many ways was seen as an experiment because it was 40 years before it was actually brought in England. So it was imposed as a rule of our tool of control. It was centralised, was moralistic, imperialistic curriculum, as said as evidenced in the literature. There were hedge schools that were there in Ireland at the time. These were unofficial schools that kind of propped up around the country as a reaction to the penal laws. The penal laws were rules that were brought in between the 1600s and 1700s in Ireland that basically meant that if you were Irish Catholic, you weren't allowed to be educated, you weren't allowed to speak your language, and so on and so forth. So these hedge schools kind of sprung up, but they were fee paying, they were demand driven, they were relational at times, they focused on classical, and classical humanism. They were grounded in local knowledge, but they were religious as well. And so you had those hedge schools on at the time when you had the implementation of the 1831 national school system. So the two of them are kind of coexisting. As the time went on, the hedge schools went out of circulation and the national school system became dominant. So when it comes to philosophy or ontological and epistemological assumptions, there was implicit rational empiricism, because like I said, it was seen as an experiment, and it was also implicitly rational empiricist because it was based on kind of the idea of, the student being a malleable force, kind of like a Lockean tabula rasa kind of, or a version of being, whereby a colonial power could implement an education system that could civilize basically the people. It had explicit theological idealism. Initially, the national school system was non-denominational, but it was still based on Christianity, albeit Catholic or Protestantism, but it was still based on Christianity. And as time went on, the Catholic Church and the Protestant and the School of Ireland, or the Church of Ireland, Protestant Church, they kind of gained control over the national schools anyway. And there was implicit classical humanism, but again, it was limited to kind of those students that were older or the upper class or could. So post-independence then, Irish secondary schools retained many features of the British schooling. For example, Irish secondary schools were based on the grammar schools in the UK, and they were very much based on the classical curricula, classical humanism, but they were reframed around national identity. Schools became a site for national identity formation, including religious. So knowledge became propositional, canonical, and centrally administered. It was a colonial inversion, I'm arguing, serving a nationalist telos. So explicitly, it was shaped by the Ratio Studiorum. So the Ratio Studiorum basically was the way of looking at education coming directly from Rome. But it also had elements of classical humanism and implicitly by rational empiricism. Again, the rational empiricism here is the idea that you can shape a nation through education, and that was very heavily administered in Ireland post-independence. So in the 1960s to the 80s, the country started opening up, and in relation to the distinction of what is considered knowledge coming from the church, that changed in 1967 with the Vatican II. So the Vatican II basically, which the Bravissimus educationists basically said that education shouldn't be so dictatorial, that it should be more about social justice and integration. So that was coming from the Vatican, and we did see a change in Irish education, and the economy was opening as well. But what was interesting was that research suggests that even though that was coming from Rome, and even though the economy was opening up to the wider world, in the classroom, it still was very much Ratio Studiorum, classical humanism, rational empiricism, still very much didactic. That began to change in the 1990s to the 2000s with neoliberal reform, neoliberalism initially in policy, documentation and education, and then more recently in the curriculum itself. So the didacts from Vatican II actually started coming into practice in the voluntary secondary schools. For example, you ended up having more lay teachers, lay board of management, so on and so forth. Policy reform emerged also under human capital theory and rights-based discourses. So there was an awful lot of acts that came in that increased rights and for special education needs and for inclusion and diversity. But there is also an argument that a lot of these were interventionists and they were deficit models with a focus on individualistic support within a market logic. It wasn't necessarily in the literature interventions that aren't necessarily seeing the other person holistically as they are. They're seeing them with a deficit that needs to be fixed in order to, again, engage with the education system. So there's a move towards inclusion of neoliberal logic, balance with classical humanism still, and a lessening of theological idealism. So post-2008, so there was the economic crash in Ireland as elsewhere, and arguably it was a cultural flashpoint. The economic collapse spurred curriculum reform. While this was presented as a paradigm shift, and it still is, it might instead, I'm arguing, reflect an intensification of neoliberal logics, now masked in progressive language. My research is saying that it's an intensification of rational empiricism, the diminished role of classical humanism and theological idealism. So the narrowing of knowledge of being and possible alternatives. And this is kind of where I am at the moment. So basically, earlier systems of Irish education prior to this reform were hierarchical, centralised, and often exclusionary and used for social reproduction in one way or another. But they also orientated learning towards externally grounded forms of meaning, moral formation, spiritual development, or civic virtue. There was still a transient element there. Neoliberalism, by contrast, flashes ontology. What I mean by that is that you are the depth is taken out of it. You're basically based on your it privileges performative outcomes. It privileges horizontal thinking. It privileges kind of more less dense thinking, but more lateral. Arguably alienates the learner from the self, other, and the world, while invoking the language of autonomy of choice. So it's presented as autonomizing and choice-based, but in reality that's not always the case. However, it does so with the acknowledgement that in Ireland this kind of economic logic is very difficult to move away from, because it enabled us as a country to move out of poverty into relative prosperity economically. That too obviously is contestable, because the gap between the have and the have-nots, as everywhere else, is growing. But it's a very, very difficult one to move away from in Ireland, because it did lead to this development for people. And also there's an argument as well that even when it comes to epistemic rationalism, or that kind of Enlightenment way of viewing the world, it also enabled us to develop this knowledge-based economy, or enabled us to kind of take a seat in the global world. So there's a lot of contestation about it. But anyway, though rhetorically distinct, I'm arguing that these epistemic forms are not neutral, and they've not persisted randomly, but rather they continue to serve the needs of the various governance, cultural reproduction, and marketization systems restricting true emancipation. So I'm arguing, and I'm only tentatively doing this, so this is what I was very interested in what was said so far today. I'm considering Bhaskara's meta-reality as an alternative. So like the deep generative tendency within being, pulse of freedom, allows unity, healing, and truth, even amidst contradiction. The meta-reality, I'm arguing, potentially offers a framework for the ontological recovery of relational, indigenous, and decolonial ways of knowing in education, including in Ireland. So I suppose what I really like about meta-reality is that it doesn't, it's not anti-scientism, or it's not completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but it still allows for relationality, or still allows for an ability to see oneself in another that's missing currently in Irish education. So that's where I am currently. So, sorry, apologies. Why is this not moving? So concluding reflections, rational empiricism is not accidental, but historically enabled, where the danger is not just epistemological narrowing, but also in the ontological conditioning of learners. Retroduction helps reveal these hidden layers. Critical realism provides a critical emancipatory frame. Meta-reality potentially opens space for deeper relational and decolonial epistemologies. And where I am now, I'm looking at phase 2. Which explores how this plays out in practice with people. I have started that. I actually started on and off for about a year and a half, but that's where I'm going from the next phase. And I just want to finish with the quote: an emancipatory education cannot be bestowed upon someone. It must be actively pursued, and that is what I am trying to do. So many thanks, and I am 17 minutes, so that's good. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I saw Jeremy's hand that went up quite early on, so I'm wondering if Jeremy has a question. If so, Jeremy, you're welcome to start.
Actually, maybe Song Ho should go first. I've been speaking quite a bit recently, and I don't think Song Ho has had as much to say, so I'll yield my spot to her.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if some codes were still up from the last session, but if you've got a question, Song Ho, please. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I cannot write down the chat in the chat room, please. Yeah. And anyway, I found it's very interesting to mention the ontological conditioning of learning, and then combining the former presentation with this presentation. I think human reflexivity is a very important issue, and then he operationalized the definition as the ability to make decisions. I think it's okay. But according to Archer, the reflexivity is not psychological traits. It's personal concern plus social context. So I think the critical realist should be cautious using the word like capacity or ability, because it's like individual achievement and denotes a notion of possessive individualization. So that's why I define the agency as a relationally emergent power, because it is conditioned by material conditions and cultures. And then I think it is very important to view the ontological conditions of learning, including knowledge, culture, and material structure, and the relation itself. Because we often think that if we increase the ability of the individual, he or she will change. Or if we put resources or material physical environment improvements, the education changes. But my argument is that if you touch the relation, he or she will change. I think does it make sense? It's like what's I forgot his name. Richard. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, Richard mentioned the psychological their self-determination motivation, and he mentioned autonomy and competency and relatedness is important. That only tackles the individual, but I think it's not genuinely relational, or there's no structure there. So I think it helps your building up your thesis.
Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely does. Many thanks. Yeah, no, it's they're kind of things that that have kind of popped up for me as well. You know, and like it's very, very difficult to even conceptualize an alternative. I remember hearing Stephen Ball speak at a conference. It was online, so it was during COVID, and he had just you know, retired, and he kind of said, you know, he's come to the conclusion now that he can say it because he's not tied to university anymore, that the whole thing should be overturned. And like I don't know. Maybe we need to kind of reconceptualize education at its core. You know, like, and if I don't know where I'm trying to go with that, but I suppose there is an argument, like, are we consistently going to reproduce if we're consistently using you know, kind of individualistic ways of looking at knowing. But you're right, relationality does definitely come into it when it comes to agency. Of absolutely, of course it does. But I'm wondering, does the actual you know, the way we make sense of that need to be more explicit in education as well, if we are going to stick with an education system. Yeah, so thank you. That definitely is going to help. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room? So over to you, Jeremy, please, if you've got another question.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Michelle, that we have to change education to its core completely. I mean, this is like everywhere. Yeah. My comment is just basically to sympathize with you because I'm also a teacher, and I've also done quite a bit of research in education, and I've also reached an epistemological dead end with regards to what CR has to offer in terms of how to conceptualize knowledge and education. I mean, you know, I've had a lot of CR friends who've been telling me, you need to read Bhaskar, you need to read blah, 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 and everything. But I'll be honest with you, it's very opaque, and it doesn't really ring much of a bell. It didn't ring much of a bell with me. But I was introduced to social realism. I don't know if you're acquainted with that, or realist social theory, yeah? And when I start reading the works of Basil Bernstein, for example, and how you know, Michael Young develops his work, and especially Carl Mayton, Robert Wilmot, Elizabeth Rata, and Brad Shipway, for example, there's a whole range, a series of books about social realist views of education, which I have found to be a lot more concrete, a lot more just more realist, actually, than what critical realism has to offer, in my opinion. I mean, this area, I mean, you've talked a lot about neoliberalism and so forth, and constructivism and so forth. I mean, social realism offers a very powerful critique of that, actually. Talks about the politics and the politicization of knowledge and education. I think it offers like very useful concepts. For example, the difference between knowledge and knower, powerful knowledge versus knowledge of the powerful, different things. How to develop knowledge through semantic waving, how knowledge is pedagogized, how it is learned, and how it is transformed by learners. I mean, this whole area, in my view, is just so much more relevant to educational theory than what Bhaskar goes on about near the end of his life, I think. It's my opinion. Maybe people will disagree, but I sort of invite you to sort of maybe consult social realist theory.
Yeah, many thanks for that. I did actually. I read quite a bit on social realist theory earlier on, Young, Bernstein, Ratta, etc. And kind of what was missing for me was the transcendental element of it, if I'm being honest. Like I find myself aligning more with Bhaskar's later work, and or even, you know, Rob Flower's work, Love in the Market, that was published last year. That for me kind of speaks more to me, but I 100% see what you're coming from when it comes to kind of, you know, practicality and kind of, you know, having something that's tangible. I definitely agree social realism, and I did go down that rabbit hole at one stage, but for me, like I said, it's I'm open to the transcendental element to it. You know, I'm kind of I'm very interested as well, kind of on the side. I'm very interested in Indigenous epistemology, including the Irish Indigenous epistemologies and the idea of, you know, connection with nature, and it's not connection with nature separatist as in like coexisting. And I like the way Bhaskar talks about the idea that you are individual and collective at the same time, you know. And so yeah, no, many thanks. I definitely have, maybe I should go back and reconsider, but for me it's the transcendental element that the transcendental realism that I really kind of want to go towards. But thank you.
Does anyone have any final quick questions before we wrap up? It's coming to the wall now. Okay, well, another quick round of applause for. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you again to the presenters. Thank you for the people that came to listen into this one, both online and in person. It's the lunch break now for 1 hour, I think. I'm sure you guys are online have got your own timetable to refer to, but yeah, I think lunch is now, yes, 1 until 2, and we've got a memory panel. So yeah, thank you all for your presentations and the contributions from the audience. I think you guys online definitely got some interesting conversations you might want to carry on there. So, you know, feel free to use this online chat if you want to stay on there a bit for lunch. But yeah, otherwise, thank you all. I was going to say thank you to the technical assistant here, Damien, but it's left now because there's no way I would have made it run as smoothly without. But yeah, thank you all, and we'll see you in the next session in 1 hour. Okay.
Many thanks.
Well done, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks. Let me just close it.
Sure, exactly. So,
We'll close this one in case anyone stays on it and wants to talk.